Today we're going to harvest our worm castings. We're practicing vermiculture, which is the process of using worms to decompose organic food waste. It's nature's way of recycling, using worms in addition to the microbes that are already present in your soil. The worm castings are nutrient-rich fertilizer. You should use it sparingly as a 1-to-4 ratio in your regular soils, and you can also use it as a top dressing. The worm castings contain a beneficial mucus that slows the release of nutrients instead of being washed away after the first rain or watering. We recommend harvesting your castings about every 3 months, and today we're going to go through our bin and harvest our castings and separate our worms and also look for any egg sacs present. If you want to increase your worm population, you need to ensure that you harvest also the egg sacs as well as your worms so that you can continue to increase your worm population. So today we're going to remove our worms and the castings from our bin. Over the last couple weeks I've been separating the new food addition scraps, and then over here they've decomposed almost all of this is going to be primarily our castings here. We want to separate the worms and any large food scraps that have been unconsumed and put them back in our bin with new bedding. The easiest way that I do this, there's several methods. You can do it with a colander. There's a lot of different recommended methods. But the easiest way I do it, and I'll show you, is to make small piles. And the worms do not like light, so they're going to try and get away from the light. You make small piles, and they're going to go to the center of the pile. And you can just leave them sit and come back in, say, 15 minutes, and the worms are going to collect together in the center of these piles to get away from the light. So this process is relatively simple. And if you leave it long enough, you can just come back and pick up your wad of worms and not really have to do a whole lot of digging. So I like this process. It's easy enough, and we only have to do it every few months. I'm going to go through the larger scraps and remove my worms. And today I want to weigh the worms to see how much our population has increased. I bought these worms 8 months ago. I purchased 1 pound of red worms from Uncle Jim's Worms in Pennsylvania. There is one problem I noticed that I learned the hard way, is that you really need to purchase worms that are grown in your local area so they can be used to the climate and conditions where you live. So because of this mishap, my worms were not accustomed to our Florida subtropical climate, and they have to live indoors because they can't tolerate the heat. So after letting my mound sit and the worms begin to collect, you just kind of knock off the top of the pile, and you'll see that the worms have all collected themselves into a nice, neat little ball. So your harvesting of your worms is complete. And there they are, all together collected. So here I'll show you another example as I begin. So if you start with your pile, you can just knock off all the castings, and the worms themselves have collected in the center, and you just keep working through the pile, and they'll get closer and closer and tighter together. Leave it sit for a few minutes, come back, and you'll have a nice, neat little ball. And it's relatively simple. Not a whole lot of sorting and picking involved. So I like this process. It's easy, and it just takes a little patience, and you can get your worms out. So now that I have the worms separated from the castings, I just give the castings once or twice over and look to see if I've missed anybody. And then I also go through the castings to remove the egg sacs, which we'll show you here. An example of an egg sac. You want to remove these and put them back in your bin with your worms so that you can increase your population. The more worms you have, the more compost you will get. So we've completed our worm casting harvest, and we're going to return our worms back to the bin with the larger scraps and the undecomposed newspaper strips. And we're going to put our worms back in our bin and add some fresh newspaper strips. And tonight's kitchen scraps will go in there to give them some fresh food to eat. You need to add a little bit of water to moisten your scraps. And I like to leave the newspaper on top as a covering to help keep any irritating pests out of your pile, and it helps reduce odor. So they always stay covered with a nice dry layer. But they need to have moist bedding at all times. You don't want your worms to dry out. And they will be happy and start over. So our castings are complete, and we have weighed out our results. So after about 2 months, we have 2 3/4 pounds of worm castings, which we can use to mix into our soils or use as a top dressing. I like to use it in my potted plants and my potted fruit trees. Next week, we'll show you how to make compost tea with your worm castings. Until next time, keep digging.